Well, I was in charge of many of the speakers and panelists who came from the East Coast and everywhere. And I told them that you're going to Hobbs, which is the now a National Energy Policy Center. So go to Google fast and or consult your maps because you'll be here again. This is the second conference, and each has generated on every coast an interest, a considerable interest in New Mexico Tech and the partnership with the junior college and Lee County. This is the second. There are more to come. I'm following Dr. Van Romero's remarks earlier about the national character and validation of this conference. Now, last year when I was here at the pump, it was $4.05 along Highway 18. The concern was in May last year, how high would the price of gasoline go? We did not know. We were on the edge of a precipice. We had no idea, and all of the analysts and consultants and models did not reveal what was to take place only 90 days after May. And that was the systemic financial collapse of the country. In September, as you know now, 6 months ago, the credit system of the United States failed. And in it, the market, which is the efficient, must be efficient to allocate prices, also failed. And we are not out of that period yet, but that was a systemic financial collapse, which then impacted very quickly on that $4.05 gasoline. And crude oil went with the financial credit collapse of the country. Along with crude oil, that is fossil energy, renewable energy. So today we are with a new administration, a policy which the voters said yes to by electing President Obama, which is simple. The policy is we are going to, as a country, we are going to approach global warming. Global warming exists, and we want to sustain it at 3.7 degrees Fahrenheit by going into the next century. The question is not what it is out there, if or but. It is a national policy to sustain temperature, global temperature, at that rate to avoid all of the consequences. And I want to repeat that because in a cycle like this, a super cycle down, many have thought, well, renewable energy will go away. It will disappear. True, there have been 14 bankruptcies in ethanol because of the credit crisis. Access to capital going to zero. Venture capital outside, none available. Venture capitalists called on credit and margins themselves and debt are not in existence. And also we have to look at hedge funds, which were a source for renewable energy. Different migrations of capital went into renewable energy, not there. 40 to 60% of renewable energy business plans were based on $80 West Texas crude. 40 to 60% of those companies projected existed in 2008 on tax strategy, tax equity. That meant they had tax credits and they could telephone Lehman Brothers or AIG, which would modify that credit, monetize it, and they would have the capital, the revenue stream to continue technology and development in the renewable energy sector. That doesn't exist because Lehman Brothers is not there. AIG is partly government owned, and there is no appetite in the current situation for tax credits. So where are we? We are with a national policy which promotes, supports as a necessity renewable energy to head off essentially a global warming phenomenon. The president has put together in stimulus and the energy bill, which Senator Bingaman will come out with, about $56 billion into the campaign, $10 billion a year for 15 years. This will continue. The U.S. government, we will, at least for 2 to 3 years, will be the major venture capital source for renewable energy. There is no other source. And the government, also the administration, is preparing for Copenhagen in the fall. That is going to be the Kyoto 2, the global treaty on warming. And so the leadership in Washington is looking toward what is the U.S. position on renewable energy, global warming, in a context where every country in Copenhagen will look to formulate a treaty. What went wrong was, as I said, a good deal of tax failure in terms of credit, and a other side of that was a good deal of speculation and different instruments, all the way from mortgages to crude oil and gasoline and so on. A note point about Senator Bingaman: he exhibited leadership almost alone in the Senate last summer, warning that this could happen in oil and gas. That is, speculation was driving prices higher without any sustainable regulation or controllable regulation. And so now we're in a period in Washington. Very soon we will see the regulation, financial regulation of energy prices. Now, in all this, with a market failure, there is a need for government, and the government is acting. However, the question is, can the government fail in renewable energy? In other words, can there be overregulation? That's a good question, because in the next few days, the Washington EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, will announce the first rule. That rule, I'm sure, will affect Lee County, Roswell, wherever there's dairy, small farms, middle farms, and businesses. 13,000 farms will be affected by what looks like an EPA rule on carbon. This is the emissions regulation coming from the EPA. 2 million small businesses, potentially. In other words, any emission from any regulated entity, which is over 250 metric tons of carbon, will be not only regulated, but assessed for the emission. And the EPA has already issued a rule calling for emissions census. In other words, what is out there? Everyone must begin at businesses and entities that will be covered, some not covered, must report yearly to EPA what the carbon emission is. So in the EPA, you have a rulemaking move very close to this conference. On the other hand, in policy, you have the Congress of the United States beginning to look at what carbon cap and trade will look like. If we do not have a carbon tax, we will have inevitably a carbon cap and trade system. It is now inevitable, some form. And how severe for some of the emissions people, how moderate, that is to be decided. What's out there now is a House of Representatives from California, the California delegation, which, remember, is only 1% of coal-generated electricity in California left. But on the other hand, Indiana and Ohio, most of the electricity is coal-fired. coal-fired, fossil energy is 80% of the carbon CO2 in the atmosphere. So what you have, if you go to a map, you have a carbon civil war in the United States, a sectional division with the Southeast joining the Midwest, with Indiana and Ohio and the Carolinas in the South defending rates, looking for stabilization of consumer utility rates against cap and trade, or essentially the EPA. What is coming in all this is a price on carbon. Renewable energy requires two elements. It requires a price on carbon and a renewable portfolio standard, that is, some percentage of a state, and obviously we're going to get a national RPS, combined or alone, some percentage of the power generated and used in a state must come from renewables. The cost of carbon must now be imposed as a price signal on all of the industrial base of the country, businesses and farms. If you have the price of carbon and you have an RPS together, then renewable energy begins to become the transforming element in the energy economy of the United States. And ultimately, the venture capital Uncle Sam is removed from the picture. So what I'm saying essentially today in the policy side, cap and trade, I say is inevitable. We are going to have a presentation following mine of the ABCs of cap and trade. And I talked to essentially Douglas Lynn, who is down in, I believe it's in the South. He has a center on algae. He's a speaker later today. And we had a conversation with regard to dairy. And he said people he talks to are alarmed that the dairy industry will be affected because of methane. Methane is the second gas in global warming. And many of those dairy farmers are here today. So the ABC fundamentals of cap and trade will follow. Why cap and trade, and why not the tax? Briefly, I'll suggest this. A cap and trade system sets a price on carbon, and the government then will set an emissions limit. It will cap it, how much carbon, CO2 in the atmosphere, and then individual regulated entities will have allowances that will be proportionate to what they emit in carbon and CO2. Beyond that, they will have to buy and sell. That's the unique part of this. Credits on allowances. They can do several things. Anticipating a very high price, a disaster ahead. And when carbon cap and trade begins, they can buy more at what? $20 a ton in the Obama OMB, and that is in the budget. I will say that the literature does not support Obama. The carbon cap, the carbon sequestration and storage, CSS, I believe will require $60 a metric ton. So the administration is far short. If they want to get the effect of a 2050 year when we have reduced the atmosphere, the global GSS, the global gases, to 80% less than 1980 or 80% less than the current year. So you need a higher price, even than the White House is saying, to get a mitigation technology going, which is the coal, the CSS, that is how to capture and how to sequester carbon. Now, finally, I want to go back to the EPA. That is what happens. I see the EPA as the bad cop. They are going to issue 90-day rules for comment. They are going to require in those rules regulation of emissions and inventory, and then impose on top of that regulation. They have, from the Supreme Court, now the right to regulate under the Clean Air Act carbon dioxide. The good cop really is the Senate of the United States. The Senate, and I should say the Congress because there's a compromise somewhere here, is deliberately moving toward a program of cap and trade which will not impact negatively on consumers. Consumers will be protected if the Senate deliberations and policy prevail. This is very important because we are still 3 to 6 quarters in a recession. The best estimates from the Deutsche Bank and others is that this will continue. And so to impose on a recessionary economy with a credit system which has not returned, with a banking system which has toxic assets yet to be liquidated, and with an atmosphere where many say is also toxic. So we have a toxic atmosphere and toxic assets combined. And in that matrix is the regulation of carbon dioxide. The most important point for technology in this is which system will stimulate innovative technology to develop the mitigation technology or the abatement technology. Will it be a carbon tax, which is a delight to professional economists and academics, or will it be cap and trade? Cap and trade has something in it that the tax system will not have, and that is it has offsets. Now think of this. If you're in Lee County and you are producing, let's say you're a small independent producer of oil, and you're now regulated, and you have an 800 number and you can trade in terms of a new cap and trade system. With an offset inside cap and trade, which will not exist in the tax system, you can reforest China. Now think of that. If offsets prevail, you can invest and buy an offset to reforest China. Or you can do landfill gas capture. Or you can do advanced agriculture and receive an offset. So the carbon dioxide coming out of Lee County in your property can be offset, neutralized, if you invest and buy into an offset position anywhere in the world. This is one way cap and trade can penetrate outside the United States into the developing world, which may not have a carbon cap and may be independent of all this. So there's a flexibility and an intervention in cap and trade. Finally, in terms of technology innovation, the cap and trade will provide with the offset again, that you can take your emission, offset it, continue it, because carbon from you is offset carbon from somewhere else. In the technology side, you can envision if you have an offset provision for Shell Oil, we'll say, or Chevron, or a small producer, what can they do? This company, or Ford, which will be with us later, they can, in a cap and trade system, get an offset for maybe 20% of their total emissions. 20%. And that would allow them the incentive to develop an engine to eliminate the 80%. It's over time that stimulates, in a cap-and-trade system, the innovation of technology. So finally, I want to conclude with this, that we are at a very serious crossroads in the U.S. because climate policy is here, and climate policy will be introduced by the president, and a cap-and-trade system seems to be the choice. But the cost will be there, the regulation and the admissions cost and census and so on. The question is how to smooth it out and go to a renewable energy economy without excessive cost to the public and to the consumers in terms of utilities and so on. That's the major challenge. Temporarily, we see in CNBC only the reports of the banks and the assets that are not have no buyers. As this clears, we are face to face with the global warming issue of climate. And there's no reversible position in this administration. It is coming. The question is enlightened leadership, mainly in the Senate, from this state, and how to